evening and welcome to Enlightening Conversations, an opportunity to discuss critical issues like social justice and racism in order for us to better understand what we can do together to make the world a better place. I'm your host, Lisa Smith, and tonight we are going to look back, actually way back, to the years prior to the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, when members of our own community served as agents on the Underground Railroad. Our guest tonight is Scott Mingus Sr., who is a local author and historian who writes prolifically about those days. Scott has over 24 published books on various aspects of the Civil War era, but tonight we're going to focus on one of his books that talks more deeply about the Underground Railroad conductors in York County, and that one's entitled Guiding Lights. Welcome, Scott. We're glad to have you.
Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate being here.
So first of all, I understand that you have a presentation with some slides and things for us to get us started. Why don't we start off with those, and we'll do questions and that sort of thing as things go along.
Sounds good. Can you see my slide deck?
Yes. Yeah, it looks
Sounds
great.
Good. So yeah, thank you again. My name is Scott Mingus. I live in Manchester Township, north of York. Moved here in 2001 with a strong interest in the Civil War. And I carried that interest over to researching York County Civil War history. And then that got me hooked on the Underground Railroad. So I want to talk tonight a little bit about some of the conductors, some of the people that were acting as agents in the Underground Railroad while living here in York County. But then I want to kind of open it up to more of a free-flowing dialogue where Lisa and I will discuss some of the aspects of the Underground Railroad. But for the first part, sit back and let's go through the slides. To really understand the Underground Railroad in York County, though, and in Pennsylvania in general, you need to understand the historic context of the differences in law between the colonies of Maryland and Pennsylvania. Because it's that difference in law that dates back more than, almost 200 years, forms the basis of what became the Underground Railroad. So just fairly quickly, Maryland and Pennsylvania had slavery very early on, both as British colonies. 1639, Pennsylvania slavery began in the Philadelphia region. It wasn't very long within a generation that dedicated slave ships were arriving in Philadelphia and unloading their cargo of human beings, mostly from Africa, onto the wharfs and docks of Philadelphia. In fact, Walnut Street in Philadelphia became fairly notoriously known as a major place for slave auctions in the early days. Now, as we all know, Pennsylvania was originally settled by Quakers, and the Quakers initially tolerated the idea that slavery would be allowed in William Penn's new colony. Over time, that's going to change. Penn himself, though, is going to use slave labor to build his house near Philadelphia. And at the time of the American Civil War, you have more than 6,000 people enslaved in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And other than Philadelphia and Montgomery County, the number one place in all of York County, or in all of Pennsylvania for number of slaves, was York County. We had more than 600 slaves in York County alone. But that's what's going on here. Now, keep in mind, in Maryland, slavery begins 4 years later. It actually begins in Pennsylvania in 1639. 1643, slavery begins in Maryland at St. Mary's. But Maryland, fairly early on, passes two laws that are going to become critical to our conversation. One is that if you are born a slave in Maryland, you are a slave for life. That's if your mother, of course, is already a slave. And the second key law is, again, no matter where your mother goes, anywhere in British colonial North America, or later the United States of America, no matter where she goes, that slave mother and her children are always enslaved. That's Maryland's law. Here's how Pennsylvania is going to change. 1758, the Quakers, through their strong opposition now worldwide to slavery from the mother church in England, have now decided they're going to abandon slavery. Here in Pennsylvania, you've got a number of non-Quakers, starting with Benjamin Franklin and John Dickinson of Dickinson College fame, who are also now starting to become quite adamant that slavery needs to end and end now. So a group of Quakers and a group of other leading businessmen in Pennsylvania formed the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in 1774. This is 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. One of their tenets is that slavery needs to stop and stop now, not only in Pennsylvania, but certainly everywhere else. Well, not a lot happens. The society doesn't get a lot of support, but then the American Revolution starts. And of course, 1777, Vermont becomes the first added state, if you will, the 14th state beyond the original 13 colonies. And as a prerequisite for joining the United States of America, Vermont abolishes slavery in their constitution. And now Pennsylvania's got more impetus to get it done. But there's this dichotomy that on one hand, you've got folks who've spent a lot of money to buy slaves, 600 or so people again in York County, and you've got people who want slavery ended now. Pennsylvania compromises, and they say that as of March 1st, 1790, slavery will be abolished in Pennsylvania over a 28-year period. So any child born to a slave mother or father in Pennsylvania will no longer be a slave, but you're going to be an indentured servant for the person who owned the slave mother for 28 years. Now, it also banned any imports, so you can no longer bring slaves into Pennsylvania. You can buy and sell slaves who were already in Pennsylvania. You couldn't bring new slaves in from Maryland or Virginia or anywhere else. If you wanted to keep your person enslaved in Pennsylvania, one of the provisions in the 1780 Gradual Emancipation Act said that you had to pay taxes and have a license, a registration, to be allowed to have slaves. And they exempted the people from Congress so that they didn't have to worry about this. But one of the other key parts of Pennsylvania's new law was that if you were an enslaved individual and you lived in Pennsylvania for 6 months, you were free. So remember, in Maryland and in Virginia, North Carolina, you're still a slave for life, no matter where you go, no matter where your mother goes. But in Pennsylvania, if you live here for 6 months, or if you're a child of a mother, enslaved mother who happens to be in Pennsylvania, you're free. So now you got this dichotomy in law among the new United States of America, where two key states bordering one another, separated by the Mason-Dixon line, have a total disagreement on how the issue of slavery is to be handled. And in fact, if you're a Maryland enslaved individual in the state of Maryland, all you have to do is get across the border into York County or into Lancaster County or Adams County and hide out for 6 months or find a friendly face to live with for 6 months. You're free. By Pennsylvania law, you're free. Maryland, of course, doesn't buy that by any stretch of imagination. But all these Maryland enslaved individuals start hearing that Pennsylvania is the place to go. And so they start running away from their plantations. They understand that, Pennsylvania's got this anti-slavery reputation now, at least, on paper. But you got this 200-mile border between Pennsylvania and two slave states, Maryland and Virginia. West Virginia, of course, didn't exist until 1863. It's still part of Virginia for parts of this argument. So you've got an unguarded, barely patrolled border that anybody can walk across from Maryland into Pennsylvania or from Virginia into Pennsylvania on the western Pennsylvania and simply run around in the mountains or find a job somewhere or live for 6 months and you're free forever. And what they also find is that a lot of people in Pennsylvania don't mind the free labor. So if you've got folks showing across the border, and they're willing to work for you for 6 months in exchange for Pennsylvania law freeing them, a lot of the good Pennsylvania Deutsch or German farmers in this region are only more than happy to take the free labor and to allow these African-American individuals to work for them for the 6 month period. There's also as you can probably imagine, a growing population of free blacks in Pennsylvania, because
Yeah.
if you're not paying the taxes, if you're willing to manumit your slave and you don't want to, you can't sell them anymore in Pennsylvania by the law. The only thing you can do is either pay the taxes or let them go. And so the black community of Pennsylvania, free black community, is growing pretty rapidly. And now you've got a natural home for African-American individuals from Maryland and Virginia in the early years. Later, they're from parts deeper south. But you've got a natural black community for them to simply integrate in, change their identities in some cases, lie about who they were. And, if you can make it 6 months again, you're fine. So Columbia, Lancaster, in Southern York County, Peach Bottom, Fawn Grove, Delta, that area, Stewartstown, become an area where African Americans tend to congregate. Well, Maryland's very upset about all this because they're losing, in their mind, thousands of dollars worth of inventory of enslaved individuals every year across the border to Pennsylvania. So Maryland finally tries to get Pennsylvania to stop this, and Pennsylvania says, no, we're acting by our laws. And so Maryland goes to the United States Congress. And they actually go to George Washington first, the president, but he's a Virginian, remember, and a slave owner. But he's also president of the North as well as the South, and Washington decides I'm not going to do anything about this, I'm giving it to Congress. So Congress has to settle the issue, and they end up passing a national Fugitive Slave Act in 1793 that says Maryland and Virginia were right, Pennsylvania was wrong, that any slave mother is a slave for life, no matter where she goes. And also, by the way, if you want to recover your escaped individual from Pennsylvania or New Jersey or New York, wherever they happen to be at that point in time, then it was the responsibility of the state or the Commonwealth, in the case of Virginia, from which the enslaved person had departed. So a sheriff or a law officer from Maryland or Virginia had to come into Pennsylvania and follow a prescribed legal procedure to actually arrest said fugitive individual and bring the freedom seeker back into the South to be returned to their owners. So with that backdrop, the key in York County becomes the Susquehanna River. As we know, it's the longest river to drain in the Atlantic Ocean. One thing people may not realize is this river was wild and rocky and very swift moving at one point before it was dammed up in Southern York County at multiple places. So this is a river you didn't just easily cross. You didn't swim. Typically, there were very few fords. The bridges didn't really exist until 1812, 1813 time frame. So in the very early days, the only way across the Susquehanna River was by ferry boat or by raft or some other conveyance. And it made a natural separation from the eastern part of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, of course, Chester County, Lancaster County, Berks County, etc., from the wilderness, York County, which at that time included Adams County, went all the way out to South Mountain. And so you've got this issue with the river. So if you're a freedom seeker, your first thing you want to be doing is get across the river because it's putting more distance between you and the ability of Marylanders to come find you. And so the Quakers, particularly those that lived along the Susquehanna River in places like Wrightsville and Columbia, Marietta, Bainbridge, places like that, began helping freedom seekers cross the river as early as the very early 1800s. And one of the first of these conductors, if you will, in York County was Jonathan Mifflin. He and his wife, Susanna, lived in Wrightsville, just northwest of the village of Wrightsville, in a house that's currently targeted for preservation. Hopefully that will happen in the next year or so. But they, in conjunction with a free black man, Robert Loney, they worked to row freedom seekers across the Susquehanna River into Lancaster County. From there, they would often be either taken to the eastern regions, Christiana area, Bird in Hand, or farther into Chester County, places like Kennett Square, Downingtown, etc., before finally going to Philadelphia, and continue to just move them deeper and deeper away from the Susquehanna River. Well, here in York County, there's a growing movement to, wipe out slavery nationwide. We've already got it pretty well wiped out now in Pennsylvania, but there's still that issue of slaves in Maryland and Virginia and Georgia and North Carolina, South Carolina, et cetera. And so there's a lot of African Americans, free blacks, some of which are former slaves, who are now living in York County. People like John Mars and James Mars and William C. Goodrich, Hamilton Gray, people like that, as well as the Quakers, band together to form an abolition society here in York. And their goal, of course, is to get slavery abolished nationwide. But while this is going on, keep in mind, slave owning is legal. Assisting in helping someone who's escaping slavery is illegal. And so you just got this new cottage industry that starts up in York County and in Maryland with slave catchers. These are folks who will assist the Marylanders and Virginians in tracking down freedom seekers throughout York County, throughout Adams, Cumberland, Lancaster, wherever they might be found. You can see on the screen just a few examples. A former British sailor in Hanover by the name of Bill Otter, who's a plasterer, well known in the Hanover area because he's 6'4". He's the tallest man in Hanover. As far as I can tell, there's nobody of this height in Hanover in the early 1800s. This guy's a giant in an era where people were 5'7", 5'8", or so. This guy's huge. He's a plasterer by trade. He goes around to a lot of taverns and he listens, keeps his ears open. And here's where, in my barn, I've got 3 freedom seekers, fugitives from Maryland living in my barn. And Bill Otter goes to the barn that night, finds the people, takes them back to Maryland, and makes reward money. Becomes the first known professional slave catcher in York County. He's not the last one. You've got government employees like John Gable here in Manchester Township, where I live. John Gable, who's the postmaster, he's a federally sworn official of the U.S. government, of course, being a postmaster. He not only puts up wanted posters, if you will, on the wall, he goes out himself and at night after his postmaster duties and tries to round up the freedom seekers and bring them back to, again, collect the rewards. Well, as all this is going on throughout Pennsylvania, it becomes a cat and mouse game of how do you move individuals. And remember, the 6-month residency rule's gone. United States Congress has overturned that. So the key now is just to keep people moving away from Marylanders so they can't find them. And that gives rise to what's now known as the Underground Railroad. It's never a railroad. It never has regular schedules, doesn't even have the same conductors from year to year to year. It's very informal, especially in the beginning. Gets a little more formalized as the years goes on. But, it's really a very loose network of individuals who know each other. Usually maybe only 1 or 2 people that further down the line. But you're going to help these freedom seekers move out of York County, out of Cumberland County, out of Adams County, out of Lancaster County, and get them, again, further north or farther east. And so as we all know, this loose network will extend throughout the north and throughout part of the south, of course. And it really is going to reach its peak in the 1830s through the late 1850s. So we're talking about a 30-year period of time where the Underground Railroad flourishes here in York County. In fact, there are some accounts that suggest that the term Underground Railroad actually originated in Lancaster and York counties, where freedom seekers just disappeared trying to cross the Susquehanna River. And the slave catchers, in frustration, believe there must be an underground railroad, an underground tunnel or something, transporting these individuals under the river. Now, I grew up in Southern Ohio. We have the same legend there that the Underground Railroad originated in Ripley, Ohio, with folks going under the Ohio River. So whether it's the Susquehanna River or the Ohio River, the term Underground Railroad becomes fixed in the American public in the 1840s. Keeping in mind, it's illegal. Every single individual that helps a freedom seeker anywhere in the United States is breaking the laws of the country. So this is the network. This comes out of a book by William Siebert, research he did back in the late 19th century, early 20th century. You can see again, my native Ohio, where I lived most of my life, was the hotbed of the Underground Railroad. Again, starting along the Ohio River in extreme southern Ohio. But if you look what I've circled in blue, that's us. That's the Philadelphia,
Mhm.
Montgomery, York, Berks, Adams, Chester County network. We're going to focus on that. We're going to focus on York County for the next few minutes. There are 5 major routes into York County at the time of the Underground Railroad's height, again, 1830 to about 1860 or so. Starting from the west, the first route went up into Gettysburg, either continued on into Wellsville, or people were taken to York. Those were the 2 major routes out of Gettysburg. There was another route that went directly up and over the mountains to Carlisle, but since it didn't touch York County, I didn't bother putting it on the map. But the 2 there, of course, are the interest moving into Wellsville, that's Quaker country, or into downtown York, which also had a fair number of Quakers as well, and a lot of free blacks. The second route went through Hanover, Pennsylvania, a place obviously near and dear to the Hanover YWCA. And it's hosted by 2 individuals, a black man and a white man, who work together, we believe, at times separately, but certainly together at points. We'll discuss both of these individuals, Bill Piper and Jacob Wirt, in a few minutes. The third route, probably the one that we believe the most people in York County used, and that was the route that followed Susquehanna Trail and or later the Northern Central Railway. That led from the heart of Baltimore County, Maryland, and led through places like Shrewsbury and Seven Valleys, Jefferson, places like that, on up into York. That was a huge route. To the east was another popular route, now Pennsylvania Route 74, which led through Stewartstown, Yo, Dallastown, Red Lion, Spry, places like that, and on up into York. And the final route into York County was one we know probably the least about. We've only really learned much about this in the last 8 to 10 years. And that was the route that went straight across into southeastern York County, and then straight across the river into Lancaster County. This was a predominantly black network of black ferrymen and oarsmen, raftsmen that operated ferry services or private boat services on the lower part of the Susquehanna River. And these folks were quite active in bringing people across the river. So with that, I want to talk about 10 or 12 individuals in not a lot of depth, but just give you an idea. This is Israel Gable's house, still there near Stewartstown. This is the Route 74 route, if you will. Freedom seekers coming up from Baltimore County often use this route. Gable's farmhouse is still there. It's not recognized often as a major stop on the Underground Railroad. I know the owner was gracious enough to send me some photographs of the place. But Israel Gable's 200-acre farm was likely the very first stop in southern York County for many freedom seekers who were headed towards York. Here's another major stop, one of which many people are familiar with in central York County. This is Apple Hill Medical Center on the south side of York in York Township. Long before it was Apple Hill Medical Center, it was the Apple Hill Farm or Springwood Farm, owned by nurseryman Jonathan Jessup, a Quaker. He had very strong ties to horticulturalists in Virginia as well as in Maryland, and they would often send shipments of trees and plants and produce north with freedom seekers hidden with the shipments. They also would give directions to freedom seekers. In fact, Jonathan Jessup's name comes up in court cases in Virginia where a freedom seeker is arrested with a map, including directions to Hanover, Pennsylvania, and from there to York, Pennsylvania, on his personage, and a personal letter addressed to Jonathan Jessup. So we have positive proof that this guy, of course, was heavily involved in the Underground Railroad. You see he and his wife, Susanna, photographs graciously donated to me by the York County History Center for use on the talk tonight. But Jessup has a number of other Quakers that he's involved with. This is Amos Grice's property, now where Counselor Park, just directly south of Counselor Park, which is a sprawling park in Manchester Township along Church Road, parallel, if you will, to US Route 30. That whole area was rife with Quaker activity, Garrettson being probably the most foremost of that. He ends up moving, by the way, to be close to his brother in Adams County, and they become the two leading conductors in northeastern New York, Adams County, along with William Wright, their good friend. Now, the other Quaker in York that I want to talk about briefly is Samuel Willis. His house still exists. This house is designated by the National Park Service as an official part of the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. It's one of two properties in York County that have the designation. This is one of the oldest houses here in Central York County in the Central York School District. First built by William Willis, who will then build the courthouse in downtown York. He's a stonemason, brick mason. His son, Samuel Willis, he's a bachelor, becomes hugely involved in the Underground Railroad with a nephew involved in him. And they start ferrying freedom seekers north to Lewisberry and on through Lewisberry into Harrisburg area. Speaking of Lewisberry, there are two doctors that are heavily involved there. One is Dr. Webster Lewis, who is a descendant of the founder of Lewisberry, and his son, Dr. Robert Nebinger Lewis, who lives in this house. This is on North Main Street or Carlisle Street, Route 74 again, in Dover. This house still exists. We've only recently discovered that this house was part of the Underground Railroad. Using some old maps and tax records at the York County History Center, I've been able to pinpoint this location for Dr. Robert Lewis. Let's go back to Hanover and talk about that for a minute. This is Jacob Wirth's house on the left, no longer exists. There's a bank there now. This is on the square in Hanover. This is the building that has the Custer maple in front of it, the marking on the sidewalk. It also has a marker on the side of the bank building that talks about this being George Armstrong Custer's headquarters during the Battle of Hanover. Well, this is Jacob Wirth's house, where it was, of course, prior to being knocked down in the 20th century. Jacob Wirth is one of the wealthier men in Hanover. He's a banker. He's an early backer and at one point the president and another early official of the Hanover Branch Railroad. He serves at least one term as the chief burgess of Hanover. He's a very important man, very important in the early history, antebellum history of Hanover. He's also the #1 conductor in southwestern York County. So, from his house on Frederick Street, from his mill that he operates outside of town, he is very active in moving people along today's Route 116, the old Monocacy Trail, Old Hanover Road. Those routes to move them into York. He's apparently assisted at times by Bill Piper in the Hanover area. Now, Bill Piper is the African-American gentleman that I mentioned earlier. He's got a reputation of being a whiskey-loving fiddler, likes a good time, and likes to give a good time. He's apparently quite talented as a fiddler. He lives in a commons right where Westminster Road meets Frederick Street. It's an area various times known as Buttstown or Pennville throughout the history of the Hanover region. Well, for one part of Hanover's history, that area was an African-American community. And Bill Piper lived there, as well as a number of other Black men. And people just think that, this guy's your run-of-the-mill fiddler. They also think he's a devout gambler because he's got people coming and going from his house at all hours of the night. And so he's got this reputation of, being pretty loose with his morals. He's got a reputation of being, running a bawdy house, if you will, where you could find all the liquor and entertainment you wanted. Card games were abundant. Except, I like this. Jesse Freisinger, years later, talks about the fact that one morning, a few of us started out of the woods above Gitt's Mill, seeing a light in the crack in the shutter of the cabin. We cautiously peeked in. There, to our surprise, sat 7 stalwart Negroes eating a well-prepared breakfast. This solved the mystery and relieved Bill from the common report that he kept a gambling house. He was an agent for the Underground Railroad. So here again, we have another, case of the Hanover individual. Piper and Wirt are the only two people we can, with any clarity, really talk about in all of southwestern New York County as being part of the Underground Railroad. Now we have anecdotes of the Durer family that's mentioned once and only once in a 19th century account. We've never really been able to isolate who they might be. There's accounts of another individual who may have been a Black person also living near Bill Piper. But, records in the Hanover Historical Society just aren't that clear as to any other individuals that were really deeply involved. Back here in York, it's not all just Quakers. It's not all African Americans. The Germans are also involved. And again, high-ranking officials. This is Charles Barnett's. His Springdale estate is now where York College is on the south side of York. He's a banker. He's much like Wirt. He's a leading citizen. He's also a United States congressman. Upholding the laws, making the laws of the United States, breaking the laws of the United States with his African-American hired workers. They're not slaves, they're free Blacks. He's got a number of people who work on his estate as cooks, as butlers, as laborers, as chauffeurs, teamsters, and he's got them all working on the Underground Railroad. And so people like James Mars and his daughter Susie Mars, or brother Susie Mars, John Johnson, Julia Johnson. There's a large number of African-American individuals that work on the Springdale estate for Congressman Barnett's, who are hustling slaves and freedom seekers, enslaved individuals east across the river. Here's another individual, Jacob Brillinger. Some of you may be familiar with this building. This was by the old Memorial Hospital on the east side of York, in East York. Jacob Brillinger, again, a banker. This seems to be an interesting connection. A lot of bankers seem to be involved in the Underground Railroad. Why? Finances. It's always good to have a network of bankers helping to finance the Underground Railroad, because this is an expensive operation. This isn't free, folks. You got to shelter people. You got to, some cases you got to build special wagons with false bottoms or railroad cars with false bottoms. You got to have barrels with false bottoms. You got a number of things you got to build and finance. You got to feed people. You got to buy railroad tickets for above ground transportation. Sometimes you have to bribe individuals to look the other way while you're transporting people. So bankers were deeply involved in a lot of this effort. This is Jacob Brillinger's house, still there again. Samuel Mifflin, who was the son of Jonathan Mifflin, takes over in the 1840s as the #1 conductor in Eastern York County from his mom and dad. And again, here's a great shot of the house that efforts are being made to preserve this and interpret this as an Underground Railroad museum or some sort of a way station along a potential heritage trail through the Wrightsville region. We'll see if that comes about. We hope so. But again, he's still working with that. And finally, in southeastern New York County, again, as I mentioned, it's mostly free Blacks. It's Henry Grant, Isaac Waters, Isaac Fields, just a number of free African-American individuals that are involved along the river. Almost all of these are former slaves or are children of former slaves that in turn are now helping modern day freedom seekers, 1850s in particular, across the river. Well, starting in 1850, the Underground Railroad goes really far underground because Congress passes an even stronger fugitive slave law, replacing the one of 1793. They passed one in 1850. By then, 100,000 slaves, enslaved individuals, have already escaped from the South. So it's kind of like slamming the door shut after after the fact, but they do it anyway. And they forced the United States Marshals to now be the enforcers of the law. Problem for Pennsylvania is you got one marshal from Philadelphia to the Juniata Hills, Juniata River. In fact, all the way out to the Laurel Highlands, one U.S. Marshal. And he's got to enforce the law versus county sheriffs, of which there were many, or town officials, town constables, police departments, etc. But as of 1850, it's now $26,000 fine in today's money, and 6 months in federal jail, federal prison. They're not messing around in 1850. And so the African-American population in York County actually goes down, because what starts happening is Marylanders start kidnapping free Pennsylvanians, selling them into slavery because they couldn't prove they weren't a slave. And so a lot of African-Americans just bail and head for Canada. And this is where the Underground Railroad really starts generating. Harriet Tubman, people like that get deeply involved in the 1850s, and now moving people to Canada, because you can't get them out of the United States, because this law makes it abundantly clear you're not safe anywhere in America that a U.S. Marshal can come find you. You have got to get out of the country now. And so there are the last two slides, there are a handful of York Countyans that in the 1850s defy this. And amazingly, they're African Americans who themselves are risking being sold into slavery. Samuel Berry down in Shrewsbury becomes the #1 conductor in Southern York County at that point in time, active throughout much of Southern York County. In Northern York County, it's an African-American man named Ezekiel Baptiste, whose house is still there as well. He worked with Harriet Tubman in Philadelphia, retires and moves to York County and becomes deeply involved in the movement in the 1850s in Northern York County. Quakers are pretty much out of it by this point in time. It's now free blacks, particularly in Northern and Southern York County. In Central York County, the #1 conductor and probably the most known conductor in all of York County is William C. Goodrich. He becomes the man in York County, starting in the 1840s and definitely running into the early 1860s. His house is now the second location designated by the National Park Service, 123 East Philadelphia Street. This is the Goodrich Freedom Center, open periodically. You can check their website. You can see the actual slave cellar, if you will, or dugout cellar, where the enslaved individuals who are now freedom seekers were being hidden by Mr. Goodrich and his cohorts, including his brother-in-law, Hamilton Gray, as well, and his good friend, Cato Jordan, and Hamilton Brown. You get a number of individuals that are deeply involved. Goodrich owns 13 railroad cars. He hides people there, including moving one of the people who escaped John Brown's raid in 1859, free black man by the name of Osborne Perry Anderson, who William Goodrich is pictured there in the bottom right, helps move into downtown York and later helps reach Canada. So Goodrich becomes deeply involved. He works with 2 black businessmen in Columbia, William Whipper and Stephen Smith. Smith later moves to Philadelphia, but they keep this network alive where these lumber merchants, William Goodrich, William Whipper, Stephen Smith, again, you can see from the illustration, they have hollowed out false ends on the railroad cars, and they're taking freedom seekers out to Philadelphia. So ultimately, though, what finally settles the question is the Emancipation Proclamation. But keep in mind, Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to Maryland, did not apply to Kentucky or Delaware or Missouri. None of the so-called border states were in rebellion against the United States. Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in territories or states in open rebellion against the government. So all the slaves along the border, including all those folks in Maryland that were still coming here to York County, Emancipation Proclamation doesn't touch them. It's not until November of 1864 that the Maryland state legislature finally outlaws slavery in Maryland, that the Underground Railroad finally comes to a halt in York County. There's no need for it at that point in time. So for the last half hour or so, we've talked about some of the leading conductors in York County. I have more detailed biographies of these individuals, as well as several others we just simply don't have the time to really discuss in much depth tonight, in the book that Lisa referred to earlier, Guiding Lights, Underground Railroad Conductors in York County, Pennsylvania. That's available from the York County History Center, TG Books, the York Emporium, Historic Wrightsville Incorporated. It's available from Amazon, from myself, from a number of other book dealers, including the York County History Center, who also published my previous book on the Underground Railroad called The Groundswell of Them Up. So with that, I'll turn it back to Lisa. I understand you have some dialogue and questions you'd like to discuss.
I sure do, Scott. I had a whole bunch of questions written in the margins throughout Guiding Lights. And now as you were going through the slides, I wrote a whole bunch more. So I'm not sure that I'll be able to cover them all in the proper order, but let's talk about the ones that the slides raised. First of all, you mentioned that if people crossed the Susquehanna into Lancaster County, it was easier to hide. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, it's true. There's a couple things. Number one, a lot of the slave catching activity was centered in Baltimore County and York County. And obviously these professional slave catchers from now Maryland, or from Hanover or from York, they're active in this area. There aren't as many professional slave catchers in Lancaster County. There's a few, but there's less. Secondly, once you get across the river, you start getting into more rural area that's a lot trickier to find. It's a wider expanse because you can take people up into the mountains and into Reading area through Morgantown, that area, and move them up through Lebanon, Reading, and farther north, deeper into the mountains. You can move people to Harrisburg from there fairly easily, and again, take them up the Susquehanna River towards New York, or you can move them to Philadelphia. And also keep in mind that the more deeper you went into places like Lancaster and Chester counties, the more anti-slavery feeling there was. So you had less population that were sympathetic to the South. We're here in York County. It's very important to keep in mind, York County and Baltimore County have always been joined at the hip. Hanover and Baltimore are joined at the hip in many ways. Many Southern York Countyans have family members in Baltimore County and always have for generations. And so there's a lot of, well, the institution of slavery, yeah, that's bad, but our family down there relies on it, and the income of Maryland relies on slavery. So, we're not so anti-slavery. You start getting close to Philadelphia, that's a whole nother ballgame.
That's different.
So you find more and more conductors, you find a lot. If you look at the list of York County conductors, I have maybe 50 to 60 that I've identified. There are hundreds in Lancaster County, hundreds of conductors, far more people that will hide you than here in York County. So it becomes more, your odds of getting caught in Lancaster County are far slimmer than here in York County, and that's documented by court documents.
Okay. I'm going to interrupt my questions to see Lou popped up again. So I think we've got a question from a viewer.
Yes. The question is, were there any underground stations in Halum?
Yeah, there was definitely at least one in Halum. In later years, it was known as the Buttonwood Tree House. In the 1920s, 1930s, and 40s, the house was known as the Chicken Pie Place. It was a fairly popular restaurant, but it dates back to colonial days. It's right in downtown Halum. It's right off of Lincoln Highway, in fact. And yes, I've got, as Lisa knows from reading the book, I've got pictures of the Buttonwood Treehouse in the book, as well as discussion on the owners, who were the Highstand family, Hiestand.
One thing I didn't understand when I first read the book, Bill or Scott, was that that there were so many free Blacks in York County. So your explanation about that 6-month time period really helped. Now I understand how that came to be. That
and also keep in mind, as I said earlier, 600 enslaved individuals lived in York County during the American Revolution. Most of them were freed in 1780 with the Gradual Emancipation Act. They stayed in York County. So you had a very large percentage of African Americans in York County from the earliest days. And so it was easier for freedom seekers from Maryland to simply try to blend into the community as much as they could.
Well, if we can flash forward a little bit, I'm thinking of the situation in my lifetime of Blacks trying to go to school Brown versus the Board of Education. What was the situation like for the free blacks at that time who had come through the gradual emancipation? Were they accepted in schools, accepted in society? What was the basic tenor of the society at that point?
It was a mixed bag. In 1803, there was an incident in downtown York that led to a riot in which York County was put under martial law, and the governor of the Commonwealth had to send in Pennsylvania troops, armed troops, to take control of the city of the town of borough of York at that point in time. Turns out there were two elderly German ladies that had an African-American cook, and they thought they had bad cherry pie. They thought she was trying to poison them. In reality, it was probably just bad cherries or bad batch of cooking. But they ended up having this African-American woman thrown in prison for attempted murder. And the African-American community in York rebelled against that. There were riots in which Black people were burning down carriage houses and barns of white citizens in York. And that again caused the governor to bring in the National Guard, or what was their version of the National Guard. This 1803 riot in downtown York led to a curfew, so that no African American could go leave York for more than 10 miles without written permission. But cooler heads finally prevailed and worked through that. And it turned out the abolitionists were blamed by the press, the York Abolition Society, for enticing people. Now, let's talk about the schools for a minute, because York did have some integrated schools, as did southeastern York County. In fact, one thing I talk about in the book is a fellow by the name of Benjamin Franklin Grant, African-American kid, whose dad, Henry Grant, I referred to on one of the slides that had the picture of the ferry boat on it. Benjamin talks about growing up in an integrated school, but life was hard because the white children were, in his case, at least he records, there was certainly some prejudice and some teasing and more malicious conduct than mere teasing going on at times. So it's really a mixed bag. I mean, you've got individuals here that are personal friends that are Black and white. You've got folks who don't like each other. But honestly, in most cases, the whites kind of stuck to themselves and the Blacks stuck to themselves. And that was kind of the York County mantra. In a lot of ways, that was the old German mantra. I mean, in some ways, the Germans and the Scots-Irish and the Welsh didn't really associate as much either. It was kind of the whole, leave me alone and, leave me to my kind type attitude prevailed. And there's still some vestiges of that even today in York County. I moved here from Ohio. I mean, and for a long time, there was a lot of, we, they, you're a Buckeye, we are Penn State. Well, and I am Ohio State. So you got, although actually Miami of Ohio, but you still got some of that, going on this, and it's more than just race. I don't want to leave the impression that it's Black versus white. It's a lot of, we're native York Countyans, you're not. We're German, you're not. So the whole race issue gets confounded by just this whole leave me alone attitude that you get.
Yeah, and you're right. I was born in Gettysburg, which you would think would be, I mean, that's practically York County, right?
It used to be York County until 1800 it was.
Yeah, well, luckily I was born a long time after that. But yeah, I remember first getting involved in community activities here in Hanover, and it's like, oh, you're from Adams County. So there is a great deal of kind of sticking to one's own. Luckily, we seem to be breaking out of that. It took us long enough, but I think we're getting there. So you referenced on the slide, let me see if I can get this name right, the wife of Mr. Barry. You said that he stood up to the slave catchers.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. Mariam Barry Samuel Berry's wife, who was the Shrewsbury African-American conductor, she was apparently a very feisty soul. One point, she is chasing people out of her house with a cane that had a dagger hidden in it. That was her
Ooh.
husband's. At another point, she walks from Shrewsbury south to Maryland line, then known as the village of Newmarket, and she
Mhm.
confronts the professional slave catchers. Here you get this little African American former Maryland slave who walks back into Maryland and goes after these slave catchers. And
Wow.
believe it or not, they never they never bothered the Berries much after she got after them. So you can just picture this, feisty little black lady going after these, grizzled, hardened guys who are raising bloodhounds and other kinds of, dogs to go chasing after freedom seekers. And here this woman walks into them and then walks home and never
And
worries
gives
about
them
the
the
fact they're
dickens in
coming after her.
between. Huh?
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
yeah.
Brave woman.
Yeah, good for her. Good for her. I also wanted to ask you, the agents that you have documented, both in Adams County, York County, were any of them ever prosecuted, arrested? Because they were breaking the law, unfortunately. What became of them?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lisa. Believe it or not, I cannot find a single documented case of a York County conductor ever being arrested. That's in York County. That's not true in Baltimore County. There are plenty of Baltimore Countyans who are helping people reach York County who are arrested in Maryland and are thrown in prison. In fact, as late as 1864, in the heart of the Civil War, you still have Underground Railroad conductors in jail in Maryland, in the city of Baltimore, who've been arrested in the 1850s in Baltimore County. But in York County, and part of that is because, again, Pennsylvania's attitude. In Maryland, slave state, we're going to nail you. Pennsylvania, wink, wink. And part of that is also, again, United States congressmen involved, bankers involved, Chief Burgess of Hanover involved. And don't ignore the fact, one of the guys I mentioned in the book, William Yoakum, he's a constable. He's a sheriff in downtown York. What's he do? He deliberately leads the sheriff of Baltimore County the wrong direction when they're trying to find slaves here in York County. He's moving the wrong way. So he's not going to be arresting Underground Railroad conductors. He's one of them. So you got law enforcement, again, on the wrong side of the law, but on the right side of morals. So it's, it's an interesting dichotomy.
Right. Yeah, it is. It's a tricky place for them to navigate, but luckily they did it and did it well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I talk about, and Jim McClure, my good friend and co-author a couple of my Civil War books, have talked about fairly often, is you really had three choices in York County. One was to break the law and to assist. If a freedom seeker knocked on your door in the middle of the night and you opened the door, you're pretty well committed. You're going to help them. And now you're breaking the law. Two, you could turn against the people and turn them in, which is perfectly legal, but probably immoral to, go grab these people that are desperate, they're hungry, they're lost, they're looking for help, they're looking for shelter, and you're going to go grab them, tie them up. In fact, in downtown Shrewsbury, in my book, Ground Swallowed Them Up, I got a great story of a long line of African Americans who are being bound together with ropes and are being dragged through the streets of Shrewsbury by York County citizens who are going to turn them in down to Maryland. But your third choice, and the one that honestly most York Countyans did, is don't answer the door. If the door rings, or to use a modern vernacular, if your doorbell rings in the middle of the night, hold the pillows over your head and don't bother to go down and see who's there. And that's what, according to York County newspapers of the 1840s and 50s, that's what most York Countyans did. They ignored it. Let's just hope you don't come to my house. And if you do, I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to turn you in. I'm not getting involved. And that was the typical response.
And I think we find that still the same for so many people when trouble is brewing and people are needed to rise up and help. There's quite a few of us, unfortunately, that look the other way. But rather they look the other way than turn people in. So,
Yeah, and the good news here in York
give
County
odds.
is I can document 50 to 60 conductors. I can only document a handful, less than 10, of professional slave catchers who actually lived in York County. So it appears that, just simply on the ratio, that the conductors far outweigh the slave catchers. Problem is, there's only 50 or 60 over a 40-year period of time. So that tells you that most of this work was either being done by just a limited number of people, or some folks were involved that we'll never know because they kept this so secret. And that leads to the one, comment I'll make that I'm often asked. People will call me up or they'll send me an email or a letter saying, I've got a house with a tunnel, or I got a hiding place in my barn. Can you verify this was part of the Underground Railroad? No, we can't. Because tunnels were built for lots of reasons. Secret rooms were built for lots of reasons. And again, unless somebody was named in a court document, some former slave said I was at the property, or a 19th century York County historians who deeply interviewed actual conductors who talked about, yeah, I took it to this farm, to that farm. Unless there were people that were missed, simply, again, we're left with 50 or 60 names.
Right, yeah. But thank God we had those 50 to 60. I remember some time ago, rumors going around that the Dobbin House in Gettysburg was the site of one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. And you mentioned Greist, I think, or if I said that correctly, who operated in Adams County. Do you know anything if that was ever corroborated, that the Dobbin House was a part of one of those stops? And would that have been where this gentleman had operated?
Actually, yeah, Grice was in northeastern York, Adams County, up near York Springs area.
Oh, okay, up that way.
But downtown Gettysburg, McAllister family that owned McAllister's Mill, that was a chief stop in the Underground Railroad. Now the Dobbin House will tell you that it was part of it, but research by Deb McCausland, who is probably one of the, if not the, leading experts on the 19th century African American community in Adams County. Deb has told me that actually Mr. Dobbin's owned slaves. It was quite the opposite, that instead of being a stop in the Underground Railroad, he was actually a slave owner. And Deb's got some documentation for that as well. So I haven't really studied that Dobbin House question in any real depth, but that's my understanding that at best it's controversial, at worst he is a slave owner.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you get involved in this area of study, Scott? I mean, 24 books to your credit, and all of this research, this doesn't happen just out of the back of your head. You've been digging and researching for decades to come up with this. How did you get started in
That's
this?
a great question. I grew up in the hills of southeastern Ohio. 10 miles from my parents' home was the equestrian statue of Union Civil War General Phil Sheridan. And 22 miles from my house was the birthplace of Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. So Sherman and Sheridan were my heroes because my great-great-grandfathers served under those generals during the Civil War. So I've always been, my dad was a World War II vet, and his uncle was World War I, and his dad was Civil War vet. So we've got tremendous amount of military history in our family and a keen interest in that. So from the time I was little, back when I was 5 years old, my parents bought me a giant playset of Mark's blue and gray soldiers for Christmas in 1962. So, it's kind of like from birth, you're kind of a Civil War guy. Although I went to college to be an engineer, which is a chemical engineer, which is what I spent my career as. I did take Civil War history classes at Miami University and heavily studied the Civil War. And when I lived in Ohio, I did a lot of research into Ohio regiments, started writing some of my first published works when I lived there. But when I moved here in 2001, to York County to go work for P.H. Glassblatter paper company headquartered in York with a mill in Spring Grove. My oldest son came out to Millersville University to do his master's thesis. And he wrote on the burning of the Wrightsville Bridge, and I was hooked on local York County history. So I've been researching York County Civil War and then the Underground Railroad for all, now 20 years this fall that I've lived here.
Well, as a Civil War enthusiast, you landed in the right place when you ended
Oh,
up
yeah.
in York County. Yeah.
Well,
'cause
I
there's
often
quite a
told
few
people that
folks.
the one and only paper mill I would ever, I was a global director, technology platform director for Avery Dennison, the office products company in Cleveland, Ohio. And it said the only paper company I will ever go work for was Glassblatter because of its area here. And it
Because
just
of the
happened to work
location.
out that that was the one that really wanted me, or at least wanted me to come interview. So I ended up here.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. And that much better for us as well, because we've learned so much from what you have written and what you've studied. So I was fascinated with some of the family stories that you told in the book. And I really like the way you laid it out, that it was, here's who they are and what they did. Here's how they were involved. And then there were the pictures to kind of pinpoint, if you're good with a map or even just the old photographs, to kind of get a visual sense of what they did. Which ones were your favorites? Were there any that stand out as their stories really appealed to you?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. I mean, obviously, I talk about the Berries. The Berry thought Samuel Berry to me is a fascinating individual. This guy he was a slave in Maryland in Baltimore County, but his owner, if you will, a guy named Enzor, allowed him to go work at night on his own at a Baltimore broom factory. So you can imagine you're working in the fields of this plantation all day long for no money. You're a slave. He owns you. And then at night on your own, instead of sleeping, you're working at a Baltimore broom factory and you're splitting the money with the guy who owns you. And Sam Berry manages to save up enough money to buy his own freedom. And he moves to York County and he still saves his money up, goes back to Maryland and buys his wife's freedom, and then goes back again and buys his children one by one to the point. And we talk about perseverance and the work ethic this man had to have to eventually free his entire family. And then he risks it all by being an Underground Railroad conductor, first in Shrewsbury and then in the late 1850s in Wrightsville, before he moves to Philadelphia, where he dies shortly after the Civil War. So he's one of my favorites, certainly by all means. Another person in the book that I talk about a lot are the Mifflins. I certainly appreciate them for their early efforts. I mean, this long before the Underground Railroad really gets started. It's the Mifflins and the Wrights in the Columbia-Wrightsville area that kind of kicked this whole thing off. So those guys are pretty heavily involved. The other one I didn't have a slide up on, though, that I admire, and I talk about them in the book, is Israel Garrettson. Israel Garrettson is a very wealthy landowner in Lewisberry region of Newberry Township. Israel Garrettson becomes almost like the Mecca, if you will, of the early Underground Railroad in northern York County. Hides people in his barn, hides people all over his property, becomes kind of a clearinghouse, pretty much whips the entire Quaker community in northern York County into a frenzy. So that, there are, of my list of 50 to 60 people involved in the Underground Railroad, a dozen of them are Quakers from northern York County. So, Garrettson's a ringleader of them all. He and a school teacher by the name of Joseph Wickersham, who has one of the other great stories where Wickersham is personal friends with William Lloyd Garrison, the well-known Boston abolitionist and newspaper publisher, who comes to Lewisberry. And at one point they see a enslaved girl who's been captured by some of these professional slave catchers being taken through the streets of Shrewsbury. And this school teacher grabs the arm of William Lloyd Garrison, and the two of them walk through this mob of individuals that are kind of cheering on the slave catchers. And they go grab the girl, cut her loose, and walk back through the crowd arm in arm to Wickersham's farm. All the
Wow.
time, William Lloyd Garrison, calmly walking beside this quiet Quaker school teacher. I mean, talk about the courage some of these people had.
Right. Right.
Another case, Webster Lewis and Robert Nebinger Lewis. Actually, in one case, Robert Nebinger Lewis, the Dover physician who headed Dover's Underground Railroad in north central, if you will, York County. Somebody points a pistol at his brain and is going to blow his brains out, but the gun doesn't go off. So this is dangerous business.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Any idea, and I know it would have to be a guesstimate probably, how many freedom seekers came through York County successfully?
That's the $1 million question. It's
Right.
been hotly debated for generations. I mean, there are numbers that Dr. Israel Betts and George Prohl, early historians in York County, back in the 1900s, who interviewed, again, these are the individuals that actually interviewed Joseph Wickersham and Israel Garrettson, a number of these conductors. But their estimates are all over the map. I mean, a fair guess, 3,000 to 4,000 individuals, but I've seen numbers as high as 10,000.
Wow.
But I think personally, I think it's less than that.
Mhm.
And one reason I say that is if you look at, and I did it, if you look at the escape records from Baltimore, Harford County, Frederick County, Cecil County, places like that, that are the most likely places for people to come to York County, the numbers are well under 10,000. So then, you start throwing in the people that would have marched through Virginia or would have come up from Anne Arundel County or, St. Mary's or other places in Maryland, Rockville, wherever. You don't come anywhere close to 10,000. So again, I'll stick to 3 to 4, but that
Mhm.
number is highly debatable.
Right. But it's still 3 to 4,000, whether it's 3 or it's 10, it's still individuals whose lives were spared, most likely,
Mhm.
or at least were greatly improved by the opportunity to taste freedom, in their lifetime. So, one last question for you. I noticed that we're a little past our 8 o'clock hour, but it's okay. It's a good topic. It's hard to get off of it. But if if this were happening today, if the situation today was like it was in the 1700s, would you expect to get as good a response from today's local populace in general, not just York County, but in general? Would people today have risen to do that? Or do you think it's different time, different era, it wouldn't happen?
Well, I think it's certainly a different time, different era. It certainly applies to the logistics. The one huge difference today is communication. So obviously there's more spying eyes, there's far more
Mhm.
cameras everywhere. So individuals that are, walking along Route 116, Jacob Wirt, bringing somebody up to York, somebody's going to see them and they're going to put it on Facebook or they're going to put a picture on
That's true.
Instagram.
Yeah.
So, to actually do this today, we would probably never know who's involved because you got to really keep your mouth shut in today's world if you're going to be involved in helping people in illegal, keep in mind, cannot stress enough, illegal
Illegal. Mhm.
activities that these folks are involved in. So you're certainly not going to talk about it. So I think there might be less people involved today. I think they might be more deeply committed, if you can even imagine that,
Mhm.
because you really got to get more creative in today's world to figure out how to help somebody. But I think the same moral question still it echoes today.
Oh, absolutely.
Somebody needs your help, no matter what kind of help. Do you help them? Do you mock them or turn them in, or do you ignore them?
Mhm.
Those are your 3 choices. What do you do?
Right.
And those are
Yeah.
the choices we face, far less, perilous than facing 6 months in federal prison, like the people who broke the Underground Railroad or the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. But we're still faced with those choices. So, we have our own
Right.
morals. We have our own, what we believe to be right or wrong. And so we have that choice today.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we have a question.
I have a quick question, then I have a comment.
Okay.
Let me ask the question. This will be our last question of the evening from the audience. The question is, they're extrapolating from your comments that the conductors or the railroad stations did not necessarily keep records. Is that correct?
There are only two major known actual records that still exist. One was William Still in Philadelphia, actually wrote a book in the 1870s or 80s based on his record books of people coming and going through Philadelphia, which included folks who came through York County first. And then Howard Sidney Gay in downtown New York City, a white man in that case, William Still being a black man in Philadelphia, he also kept records. We have never found a single recorded written diary or document or letter here in York County from anybody that says, you know, on January 3rd, these people came. On January 5th, those people came, unlike in Philadelphia or New York City. There were, I tend to believe there were records, but remember in 1850, boy, you know, facing 6 months in prison, it's very convenient to put your records in the fireplace.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Absolutely.
And
And
then,
the comment you received?
nope, it's a comment from me personally.
Oh, okay.
So being a gentleman of Jewish descent and have spent some time in Israel and talked to and lived with survivors of the Holocaust, it's striking to me the parallels that I'm hearing from the 1800s to the 1940s of their stories of survival and escape and the dichotomy of people that would either help them and break rules and risk their own lives or look the other way. So
Yeah, Louis, let me corroborate that by having been in Anne Frank's house in Netherlands, how similar the concept is to the Underground Railroad. Hidden rooms, don't talk about it, secret knocks, secret codes, trust only certain people. Yeah, it's exactly illegal since the Nazis were obviously in control of the Netherlands at that point in time. So, you know, Anne Frank, Corrie ten Boom, you can, you know, there's all these different stories. You might as well call them the conductors, if you will, for Jewish individuals. My dad was a member of a military unit in World War II and happened to go to one of the concentration camps. And that profoundly impacted his life. You imagine these GIs, in his case, he was an Air Force staff sergeant. You know, you see sites, you know, grow up on a farm in Ohio, you never should see. So yeah, I think there's a ton of parallels. Absolutely.
I agree.
You know, it's interesting.
Thank you very much. I appreciate hearing this history, and it touched me very deeply.
Before we sign off, Scott, you know, your comment about your father, my dad as well witnessed one of the concentration camps in Germany. And you're right, it does. It changes that individual. And I think it changes their children because the way that they go about loving and accepting other people is different after that kind of an experience. So, and to be, just to tie it back to the YW, the Racial and Social Justice Committee of the YW has been investigating for the last year various times and occasions of racism or anti-Semitism or, you know, pick any group that has been persecuted. We've studied a lot of that through our book clubs and other programs, and it's the parallels are amazing. You know, any group that has been persecuted for one reason or another, there are folks on the other side of that have those three choices that you mentioned, Scott. And doesn't matter what the time in history is, it still comes down to those three.
Yeah, and I'll just very quickly mention that my own ancestors in 1709, 1710 were religiously persecuted in southwestern Germany and left of what was was then known as the Palatine movement,
Mhm.
had to leave Europe and went all the way to what became the United States, upstate New York. So I'm if you will, a product of that kind of, being forced out of your home and out of your homeland because of your beliefs are different than someone else's.
Mhm. Yeah, what we do to each other as human beings is sometimes just unbelievably sad. Um, and that really is part and parcel of what the YW is about when we talk about the YW mission being the elimination of racism. It's not just a black and white issue or a black or a white and brown issue. It has to do with people who are persecuted for all different reasons. I thank you so much for your time tonight, Scott. This has been fantastic. I could go on for another hour just to hear more stories, but I know we do need to wrap it up. And there's a couple of two comments that I need to make before Lou pulls the plug and takes us off the air. One is that we've been doing, as many as of you are aware, we've been doing the Enlightening Conversations now since, I believe, last October, it may have been, or September. I've lost track. But in any event, all of those are recorded. Lou not only airs them, but he records them, and they are available on YouTube. And if you're looking for any of a particular background or any particular topic that you think, I think they did one on that at one point, and you can't find it, just get in touch with Lou Mart at the YWCA in Hanover, or drop me a line and I'll be glad to direct you to it so you can hear it. We will be breaking with Enlightening Conversations over the summer, but we'll be back in the fall, most probably near the middle to end of September. And so please keep your eye on the Facebook for the YWCA and also their website, and look for announcements with the topic and the speaker. If you have a topic that you want to hear about, let us know. Drop a note to the YW, please, and let us know, because we will be happy to find someone to help us through that. One final thing is I have to mention the Summer Against Racism series that the YW has put together for this summer. This is a phenomenal package of programs that I think everyone will definitely enjoy. I'm going to split the screen here if I can, so that I can bring this up and take a look at it. There are several different programs that are being offered, and you'll find all of them listed on the YW website as well as on Facebook. But just to highlight a few of them, June 3rd, so that's already next week, the YW will be taking a group of people to the Queensgate Theater in York to see Final Account. That's a new movie that just came out this year. It contains never before seen interviews with the last living generation from Hitler's Third Reich. So this is the past speaking to the present. And these are groups of people that in a few years, they won't be here to tell us their experiences. So this is an unprecedented documentary. I think it would be well worth seeing. June 12th, the Upstanders, who is our energetic group of young teens that do things for the community through the YW, they will be holding a puppet show and activities and running games and offering snacks and all of that at Work Park for children and families alike. Of course, Juneteenth is the big celebration, and that is June 19th. It's a community-wide celebration that'll be held at Work Park in collaboration with the Hanover
Diversity Alliance.
Thank you. I couldn't quite get the initials together. I can't read my own handwriting there. And we will it'll include speakers, crafts, a drumming exhibition and drum circle with Joe Clark, and the showing of the movie Hidden Figures, which this one came out a few years ago, so you may have seen it, but it's always a good one to see again. And it's about the Black female calculators who helped ensure the success of the early Apollo program. I always like the fact that they referred to them as calculators until we created machines that did calculating. But before that, we relied on women. July 15th, our adult book club will be studying your book, Scott, Guiding Lights. The one that we talked about tonight, we'll be studying it in a little bit more depth. Saturday, July 17th, we'll be touring the William Goodrich House in York, and that will be a specific group of people that you must make a reservation ahead of time so that we know that we have enough space for everybody. We are planning on a Spanish language outdoor movie, and there is a teen book club with the title was just announced today. Do you have that, Lou? The teen book club?
I don't have that information
Yeah.
yet.
Yeah, I don't have that in front of me either. I know that I did see it come through the email, and but I wasn't able to snag it off the printer in time before we went on the air. So check the YW Facebook and the website for that. So, and I believe that pretty much covers it.
That is correct. Quick, and I'm sorry to keep everybody. Last closing comments here. Wonderful series. Like us, follow us on social media. We're on all of them: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube.
We do it all.
Deb Smith, our social racial justice coordinator, has done a great job in her position and brought us this series with our learned host, Lisa Smith. Thank you very much. And just remember, folks, YWCA, not only are we working towards eliminating racism and empowering women, but we're promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. We walk it, we talk it, we preach it, we do it. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Lou.